A dog walked 50 miles to find its owner, but then this happened. His entire body trembled with anticipation. Max pawed at the door again, letting out a soft, plaintive whine. Everything else, the fear, the exhaustion, the throbbing pain in his feet, faded into the background. Clay was on the other side of that door. He had to be. Inside, a weary nurse heard the scratching. She parted the blinds on the small window in the door and peered out into the hallway, eyes widening at the sight of a battered dog. With cautious steps, she opened the door enough to poke her head out. Max pressed himself forward, trying to slip inside, but she blocked him gently. "Where did you come from?" she asked in a hushed voice, as if not to disturb the patient behind her. Max continued to whine, pushing against her legs. The nurse glanced at the occupant of the room, a man hooked up to machines, face obscured by an oxygen mask. Then she looked back to Max, an unspoken question hovering in her expression. Had this dog come for him? She crouched down and gingerly ran her hand over Max's head, noticing his trembling. His eyes were fixed on the man in the bed. The nurse bit her lip, torn between hospital rules and the palpable desperation emanating from this animal. At last she stepped aside. "All right, just for a moment," she whispered. Max rushed in, nearly stumbling over a chair by the bedside. The room smelled of antiseptic and plastic tubing, but beneath it all was Clay's unmistakable scent, a bit fainter, tinged with medications and sickness, yet undeniably his. Max let out a small, joyous yelp. He stood on hind legs, resting his front paws gently on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in weeks he saw Clay. Clay was a ghost of himself, pale and unmoving under the hospital sheets. One arm was in a cast. Bruises covered his face, and the lines of pain were etched deep. A swirl of tubes and wires connected him to the machines that beeped steadily. Max whimpered, gently nudging Clay's hand with his nose, as if urging him to wake. The nurse looked on, tears gathering in her eyes. Suddenly, voices echoed from the hallway: security guards, nurses, someone calling out, "Where's that dog?" The nurse glanced at the door, heart pounding. She knew she should shoo the dog out, let animal control handle it. But the sight of Max, so relieved yet so anguished, held her back. Instead, she slipped into the hallway, telling the others she would handle the situation. The voices receded, though a security guard lingered, radio in hand, uncertain. The nurse calmly assured him that the dog wasn't causing harm and that the patient was stable. For now, they left her to it. Meanwhile, Max pressed his nose to Clay's cheek. A tear slipped from the corner of his own eye, mixing with the dried mud and grime on his muzzle. The past weeks of endless searching, the gnawing hunger, the near-death experiences, all of it culminated in this single moment. But Clay did not stir. The rhythmic beep of the machines continued, the oxygen hiss unwavering. The nurse placed a gentle hand on Max's back, her voice trembling with empathy. "He's in a coma, sweetheart. Car accident. He hasn't woken up." Max's ears drooped. He glanced from Clay to the nurse, a questioning whine escaping his throat. Could he do nothing to rouse his beloved human? Time seemed to stand still in that sterile room. The nurse knew her superiors would soon demand that the dog be removed. Hospital policy was clear, and they couldn't risk infection or chaos in the ICU. Yet her heart broke at the sight of this ragged animal, who had somehow traveled untold distances to find a man lying unconscious. She leaned down, whispering, "He might hear you. Talk to him." Her own voice cracked on the last word, aware of how surreal the situation was, asking a dog to somehow communicate with a comatose man. But Max needed no instruction. He placed his head on Clay's unmoving chest, closed his eyes, and let out a mournful sigh that seemed to resonate in the stillness. It was as though he was pouring every ounce of longing, love, and devotion into Clay's broken body, willing him to wake. A few tense minutes passed before the door opened again. The security guard and 2 more medical staff stepped in, faces grim but curious. The nurse rose, prepared to argue on Max's behalf, but the guard simply held up a hand. "Give it 5 more minutes." "Then we have to get him out of here," he said quietly. The nurse nodded, gratitude shining in her eyes. So Max stayed. He inhaled Clay's scent until it filled every fiber of his being. His tail moved in a slow, hopeful wag. The steady beep of the heart monitor offered a rhythm, reassuring him that Clay was alive, if not awake. The minutes slipped by in a haze of emotion. When the guard finally approached to escort him out, Max resisted, whining, pawing at the blankets. The nurse gently coaxed him, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said, voice thick with sadness. "He needs rest and we'll get you cleaned up." She whispered to the guard, "I can call the local shelter. They can check if he's chipped. Maybe there's contact info." Max jerked back as the guard looped a slip lead around his neck. Panic rose in him. He had not come all this way to be locked up, but exhaustion and heartbreak sapped his strength. He allowed them to guide him from the room, casting one last look at Clay's still form. The door closed behind them, and the beep-beep-beep of the monitors faded. The next hours were a blur. Hospital staff scrambled, uncertain what to do with a dog that had barged into the ICU. The security guard tried to keep Max in a supply closet near the loading dock. The nurse who had helped him snuck in occasionally, offering food and water. She petted him, whispering comforting words, but nothing could dull the ache in Max's chest. Clay was so close, yet unimaginably distant. Eventually, animal control arrived, a middle-aged woman with a gentle demeanor. She took one look at Max, battered and exhausted, and sighed. "Poor guy," she murmured, scanning him with a microchip reader. "Nothing." Then she noticed the healing wounds on his paws and the general state of malnutrition. "He's been on quite a journey," she told the nurse. "You think he belongs to that patient upstairs?" The nurse hesitated, tears reappearing in her eyes. "He must. I've never seen devotion like that. But the man is, well, we don't know when or if he'll wake up. No ID on the dog either." The animal control officer nodded. "I'll take him to the shelter. We'll keep him on a stray hold for a bit. Then, if the owner recovers, maybe we can reunite them." Max whined at the word shelter. He didn't understand but sensed separation. The nurse leaned down, pressing her forehead gently to Max's. "I promise," she whispered, "I'll look after you, and if he wakes up, I'll let him know you're here." Max could only gaze at her, eyes mirroring his heartbreak. Outside, the late-night rain had started again. The animal control officer lifted Max into the back of her van. He didn't fight her. He had nothing left to fight with. The doors shut, leaving him in darkness punctuated by flashing streetlights. He lay down, muzzle on his paws, the hum of the van's engine lulling him into an uneasy sleep. In his dreams, he was back in that hospital room, Clay's eyes fluttering open, his lips curving into a weak but joyous smile as he recognized his dog. The reality was far different. The shelter was a cramped, echoing place. Rows of kennels lined each corridor, filled with dogs who barked and howled at the arrival of a newcomer. Max slunk into the cage assigned to him, sinking onto the cold floor. It was clean enough, and the staff provided a soft blanket, but it was still a cage. He rested his chin on his front legs, ignoring the water bowl and kibble for now. All the will that had driven him to walk those 50 miles seemed to drain away, leaving him hollow. He was so close to Clay, yet unimaginably distant. Days passed in an agonizing limbo. The nurse called the shelter several times with updates. No change in Clay's condition. He remained in a coma, stable but unresponsive. The shelter staff tried to comfort Max. Some praised him for his bravery. Others wondered if the man in the coma would ever come to claim him. They marveled at how an animal could demonstrate such unwavering loyalty. But for Max, each day felt like an eternity. Behind the chain-link door, he paced anxiously or curled up on his blanket, staring at nothing. Outside, other dogs came and went, some adopted, some reclaimed, but not Max. No one recognized him. No one knew the man in a coma who might be his owner. Despite his despair, Max's body began to heal. The shelter's vet treated his wounded paws. Nutritious meals helped him gain back weight. After a week, his fur took on a healthier sheen. Still, he carried the weight of a soul that refused to settle. At night, when the lights dimmed and the barking quieted, he would lift his head, imagining he could hear Clay's voice in the distance. Then one day, an extraordinary event shattered the routine. The nurse from the ICU arrived, her eyes bright with excitement. She spoke in hushed whispers to the shelter director, who nodded and pointed down the hallway. Moments later, the nurse stood before Max's kennel, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He's awake," she whispered, struggling to keep her composure. Clay woke up. Max sprang to his feet, paws pressed against the chain link. His tail thumped wildly against the kennel walls. Even though he didn't fully comprehend the words, he recognized the hope in the nurse's voice. She opened the kennel door, and Max bounded out, nuzzling her with a frenzy of excitement. She laughed through her tears. "They said he was asking for his dog. Didn't know your name, but he kept saying, 'My dog, my dog.'" The shelter staff helped the nurse fill out paperwork, ensuring Max could temporarily leave with her. There was no guarantee that Clay was strong enough for visitors, but the nurse was determined to reunite them. "If the hospital won't allow it," she murmured, stroking Max's ears, "we'll find a way." The drive to the hospital was surreal. Max pressed his nose to the window, watching buildings and lights blur past, his heart pounding with anticipation. The nurse parked in a side lot, away from prying eyes, and led Max through a discreet entrance. She had carefully planned this, enlisting a sympathetic doctor's help to smuggle him onto Clay's floor. If the hospital administration discovered what they were doing, there would be consequences. But love and compassion sometimes exist beyond the bounds of policy. They navigated a dimly lit corridor, taking a service elevator to bypass the main thoroughfares. At last, they arrived at Clay's new room, less critical than the ICU but still lined with medical equipment. The nurse tapped lightly on the door. Another nurse inside opened it, eyes widening, then nodded in quick understanding when she saw Max. Inside, Clay lay propped up against pillows, a bandage around his head, eyes half-lidded with fatigue. He looked weak but undeniably conscious. The moment Max entered, Clay's gaze sharpened, his lips parted in disbelief. "Max," he croaked, voice strained and raspy. Max dashed forward, placing his front paws on the edge of the bed, tail wagging in ecstatic circles that seemed ready to lift him off the ground. He licked Clay's hand, then his forearm, pausing only to gaze up with shining eyes. Clay's face crumpled, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. His uninjured hand gently stroked Max's head, each movement slow and deliberate, as if verifying that this was real. He found me," Clay whispered, voice thick with awe and remorse. "He actually found me." The nurse in the room dabbed at her own eyes. The nurse who had brought Max stepped closer, describing how the dog had wandered into the ICU and how he'd been waiting in the shelter. Clay listened, his throat working as he tried to form words. In the end, he simply wrapped his arms around Max, ignoring the protests of his sore muscles. Max nestled against his chest, eyes closed, breathing in the man's familiar scent. They stayed like that for a long time, the hospital room hushed except for the beep of machines and the hum of fluorescent lights. Outside, a doctor approached, intending to confront whoever had brought a dog into a patient's room. But seeing Clay and Max clinging to each other, he quietly backed away, leaving them in peace. Eventually, Clay spoke again, his voice laced with regret. He explained how the accident had happened just after he left the diner. He'd gone inside for a quick sandwich, then hurried out to keep an appointment. Unaware that Max had jumped from the truck bed to follow him, Clay drove off. A few miles down the road, a drunk driver swerved into his lane, causing the devastating crash. Clay's phone was destroyed in the wreck, leaving him unable to contact anyone. By the time he regained a semblance of consciousness, he was already slipping into a coma, powerless to call out for Max or explain the situation to the staff. His words broke into a shaky sob. "I never meant to leave you," he whispered to Max, gently cradling the dog's muzzle. I promised I'd never abandon you. I'm so sorry." Max licked away the tears that fell from Clay's cheeks. The only thing that mattered to him was that Clay was alive, and they were together again. The quiet exchange was profound. No blame, no anger, just an overwhelming sense of relief and love. It was enough to bring the nurses in the room to tears. In the days that followed, Clay continued to improve. The hospital administrators relented, allowing Max to stay in a corner of the room provided he was well behaved. And he was. He never barked, never roamed the halls. He remained at Clay's bedside, stepping out only when the cleaning staff needed to tidy or when a nurse coaxed him with a gentle walk around the grounds. Staff and patients smiled whenever they saw him, touched by the living proof of devotion that had traversed 50 miles of hardship to land in a sterile hospital room. News of Max's journey spread through the hospital like wildfire, eventually catching the attention of local media. A reporter interviewed the nurse who first found Max outside Clay's ICU room. Soon, their story went viral, a battered dog walking miles upon miles to find the owner he loved. Donations poured in to help Clay with medical bills and to ensure Max would never want care again. Strangers left gifts at the hospital reception desk: dog toys, treats, handmade blankets. Even the hospital's strict policies bent under the weight of so much goodwill. It became a regular sight to see Clay, wheelchair-bound during his recovery, with Max trotting beside him. Each day, as Clay regained strength, they ventured a little farther, down the corridor, through the waiting area, sometimes even out to a small courtyard. Max would watch Clay carefully, attuned to every labored breath and cautious step. If Clay winced, Max was there, pressing his body close, offering warmth and solace. Their bond had evolved beyond companionship into something sacred, forged by near tragedy and unwavering faith. Eventually, the doctor declared Clay well enough to be discharged, though he would need ongoing therapy. Cameras flashed as they left the hospital together, Max leading the way, tail wagging like a banner of victory. Clay's voice quavered with gratitude, not just for the medical staff and well-wishers, but for the dog that had refused to give up, even when the world had become a desolate maze of roads and heartbreak. Their ride home was in a borrowed SUV, driven by a friend Clay had from his job. Clay winced at the sight of a green pickup truck on the road, a stark reminder of the accident, but Max rested his head on Clay's lap, grounding him in the present. The trip felt unreal, an exodus from pain and uncertainty into a future that beckoned with promise. When they reached Clay's small apartment, newly with some safety features to accommodate his healing injuries, Max bounded inside as though returning to a long-lost kingdom. The walls and furnishings carried Clay's scent, but everything felt different. This was not the old life they had known, but it was a life they would forge anew together. Clay settled into a recliner, still moving gingerly. Max jumped onto his lap, careful not to jostle the bandaged arm. They sat quietly, sunlight streaming through the window. In that warm glow, the entire ordeal seemed distant, yet it was etched in their hearts, a testament to the resilience of love. Days turned into weeks. Clay's physical therapy was grueling, but with Max at his side, he found the motivation to keep pushing forward. On weekends, they took short walks through the neighborhood. People recognized them sometimes from the news stories. Children would run up to pet Max, exclaiming, "It's the miracle dog." Clay would smile, telling them the real miracle was the power of loyalty that had brought them back together. Despite the outpouring of support, Clay struggled with guilt. He would wake in the middle of the night, haunted by the idea that Max had suffered so much because of one fateful day and a twist of circumstance. Yet each time he looked into Max's gentle eyes, he saw only forgiveness and unconditional love. The memory of Max's battered paws, each step driven by the unwavering belief that Clay was out there, humbled him. Their life now was about healing, both physically and emotionally. News outlets occasionally checked in on them. Donations, which Clay tried to refuse, kept arriving. He used what was necessary for medical expenses and insisted that the rest go to local shelters. Max had enough trouble finding me, he told reporters. I want to make it easier for others to find a loving home. In the quiet moments, those sunsets that bathed the apartment in soft oranges and pinks, Clay would feel the weight of Max's head resting on his knee. He'd let his hand drift through the dog's fur, each gentle stroke a silent promise. Never again would they be parted by neglect or chance. They were a team, two survivors of a harrowing journey. Their story had become legendary in the region, but to Clay, it was simply the reestablishment of the vow he made the day he adopted Max. I will always be there for you. And so, in the hush of an evening breeze, they found solace in each other's presence. Max, content at last, drifted off into a peaceful sleep, no longer plagued by nightmares of highways and thunderstorms. Clay, too, found rest, grateful for a second chance at life and determined to make every moment count. Together, they existed in a space that was neither perfect nor easy, but filled with a quiet, profound bond that only deepened with each passing day. Outside, the world moved on. Cars roared past on distant roads. Storms raged in far-off skies. But within that modest apartment, a man and his dog had carved out an oasis of hope. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side, bound by a love that had proved itself stronger than distance, time, and the hand of fate. In the weeks following Clay's discharge, word of his and Max's story continued to spread throughout neighboring towns, even attracting a few visitors and well-wishers to Clay's apartment. Most people regarded it as an uplifting tale, an example of how devotion between a pet and its human could overcome impossible odds. Clay appreciated the support, but also noticed a subtle tension settling in his bones. The spotlight felt too bright, especially when he was still navigating pain and rehabilitation. One drizzly morning, a knock on the door brought a surprise. A lean man in a neat button-down shirt, carrying a leather bag. He introduced himself as Kay, a documentary filmmaker. The man's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as he explained how he wanted to produce a short film about Max's incredible journey. He spoke quickly, as though each word was precariously balanced on the next. "I've followed your story since I heard about it on the local news," said. "It's extraordinary. I want to film interviews, show the path Max took, maybe talk to the shelter staff and hospital personnel. We could even set up a small reenactment of key moments." Clay felt Max press against his leg, tail swishing in casual curiosity. In the living room, evidence of Clay's slow recovery was everywhere. A walker near the couch, a pile of physical therapy bands, a box of pain medication. He glanced at it all with a weary sigh. "I don't know," Clay said, rubbing the bandage that still wrapped his left arm. "We've been through enough and I'm still not at 100%. I'm not sure I can handle camera crews and reenactments." Nodded sympathetically, but his gaze lingered on Max with a wistful curiosity. "I get it, but I think the world needs stories like this, about loyalty, love, and not giving up. If we can show people what Max did, maybe more dogs like him will find better care, or more people will realize the depth of animals' emotions." Those words struck a chord in Clay. He remembered how, during his own darkest hours, stories of perseverance had given him hope, and hadn't he vowed to pay forward the kindness that had been showered upon him and Max? Maybe this was part of that. He sighed. "All right," he said at last, "but keep it low-key. We're not in any shape for a Hollywood production." Grinned, relief washing over his features. "You won't regret this," he promised. "We'll keep it small, just me, a camera operator, and maybe an assistant. We'll let you guide the pace." Over the next week, set up interviews. The nurse who had helped Max at the hospital was thrilled to recount her story. The animal control officer who picked up Max, the shelter staff who cared for him, and the older man who'd found Max on the roadside in the early part of his journey. All shared their recollections with a mixture of awe and fondness. Also wanted to interview Clay's diner who might recall the day Clay left, but that lead didn't pan out. Apparently, the had moved away. When finally sat down with Clay and Max in the living room, a small camera set up on a tripod, Clay felt uncharacteristically nervous. His leg was propped on a cushion, and he wore a brace on his left wrist. Max settled at his feet, occasionally resting his chin on Clay's knee. "Let's start from the beginning," said gently. "How did you and Max first meet?" Clay smiled, the memory warming him like a soft blanket. "I found him in a shelter when he was a pup, maybe 6 months old. He was so timid, but when I walked by his kennel, he looked up at me with these eyes, like he was already mine." Max's ears perked, as if he recognized the story. Clay continued, talking about the small moments that bonded them. The day Max first wagged his tail in Clay's apartment, the nights Clay spent soothing him through thunderstorms. Asked about the day of the accident, and Clay explained it in a wavering voice. How he just popped into the diner, how he believed Max was safely in the truck bed. "But I guess Max jumped out, or maybe I forgot to latch something," Clay said, guilt weighing on each word. "I drove off, never knowing I'd left him behind." Tears threatened to spill when he recalled waking up in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness with no way to find his dog. Through all the surgeries and the coma, one question tormented him. Where was Max? He wiped his eyes, resolute. "To think he walked 50 miles, maybe more, looking for me. It breaks my heart, but it also reminds me that we have something special." Nodded, expression somber. "It's incredible. You both endured so much." He glanced at Max, who gazed back with gentle eyes. "Do you ever wonder what went through his mind during those weeks?" Clay swallowed hard. "I think he just knew we weren't done. We had more life to share, more moments. That's the only reason he'd go through all that. Love like that, it's a force." The interview ended quietly, both men visibly moved. Thanked Clay, promising to keep in touch about the final edit of the documentary. As he packed up his camera, he knelt to pat Max's head. "You're one hell of a dog," he murmured, smiling. Several days later, invited Clay and Max to revisit some of the sites along Max's journey, to film cutaway shots for the documentary. Clay was hesitant, still finding it difficult to move around. Yet a part of him wanted closure, to see the path that Max had walked with his own eyes. He agreed, provided the schedule remained flexible and allowed him to rest. One crisp morning, Clay slid into the passenger seat of SUV. Max hopped into the back, sniffing curiously at the gear. They drove out of town, heading toward the now-defunct diner where everything had started. The landscape blurred by farmland and small houses, each mile sending a twinge of pain through Clay's healing body. But he pressed on, for Max's sake, maybe for both their sakes. They arrived at the diner's cracked parking lot. His camera operator filmed wide shots of the empty space, a ghost of busier days. Clay stood for a moment, leaning on his cane, staring at the spot where he had last seen his truck, where he believed Max had been waiting. Emotion swelled in his chest. "I had no idea," he whispered, trailing off as he bent to scratch Max behind the ears. "I'm so sorry, buddy." Max leaned into the touch, tail wagging softly. Captured the quiet moment, the lens a silent witness to the deep currents of regret and relief that swirled around them. A gust of wind rustled the weeds poking through the pavement, as if echoing the passage of time. They retraced the path toward the highway, stopping at a stretch of road where had arranged to interview the older man who first picked Max up in his truck. The man, leaning against a fence post, recounted how he'd found Max nearly unconscious by the roadside. "I never forgot that look in his eyes," the man said. "It was like he'd already decided he was gonna keep going, no matter what, until he found whoever he was searching for." Clay gripped his cane, swallowing the lump in his throat. If not for that stranger's kindness, Max might not have survived to complete his journey. He expressed his gratitude. The man just waved it off. "We do what we can, son," he said, a gentle smile creasing his weathered face. As the sun climbed higher, led them further along, stopping at the barn where Max had sheltered, the creek where he'd drunk his fill, and the small town where he'd been turned away from the hardware store. Each location brought fresh stories from people who had fleetingly encountered the determined dog. Some recognized Clay and Max from the news. Others only now realized the significance of the stray they'd tried to help. A few wept openly, describing how desperate and hungry Max had looked, how they'd wished they could do more. Clay felt both sorrow and gratitude washing over him in equal measures. Sorrow for what Max had endured, gratitude for every act of compassion that had kept his beloved companion alive. With each stop, he sensed Max growing calmer, as if picking up the pieces of a puzzle that had once been too large to grasp. Now, reunited with Clay and fully aware that he was safe, Max walked beside him with steady confidence. They paused at a dusty turnout, the same spot where Max had collapsed in a ditch. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the road. Clay lowered himself onto a rock, exhaling a trembling breath. Max sat by his side, panting softly, turned off the camera for a moment, stepping over. "You okay?" he asked Clay. Clay nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I'm just imagining him here alone in pain, and I hate that I wasn't there for him." He placed a hand on Max's back, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur. "But I'm so proud of him, too. If he hadn't done it, if he hadn't come to find me, I might never have known he was out there, or I might never have woken up with that drive to see him again. We saved each other in a way." Matt placed a reassuring hand on Clay's shoulder. "That's the story we want to tell." They wrapped up filming as dusk settled, the sky ignited with streaks of violet and orange. Drove them back home in a companionable silence. In the back seat, Max rested his chin on Clay's shoulder, occasionally nudging him as though to say, "I'm still here." By the time they reached the apartment, Clay felt utterly drained but also oddly lighter. Confronting the physical evidence of Max's journey had given him a kind of closure. In the days that followed, Clay went back to his routine of physical therapy and gentle walks with Max. He no longer needed the walker. The cane sufficed, and he was determined to be rid of it soon. Nights were peaceful now, with Max curled up at his feet, content. Clay sometimes caught himself waking in the dark, gasping, his mind conjuring the squeal of tires and the crash of metal. But Max was always there, stirring, pressing a comforting snout to Clay's arm until the nightmares ebbed. One crisp morning, Clay heard a knock at the door. Expecting perhaps a neighbor or a delivery, he was surprised to see an older man with a regretful expression. He introduced himself as Carl, the diner's owner who'd been working the day Clay vanished. Carl explained he had moved on from the diner soon after but always felt bothered by what had happened. "I just wanted to see how you and your dog were doing," Carl said, hat in hand. "I should done more that day. I saw you leave, though you had the dog with you. By the time I realized he was alone, you were gone." Clay didn't know how to respond. He still grappled with his own guilt. But seeing Carl standing there, clearly weighed down by remorse, reminded him that none of them had intended this. It had been a series of tragic coincidences. In a gesture of forgiveness, he invited Carl in for a cup of coffee. They talked awkwardly at first, gradually relaxing as they shared their pieces of the puzzle. "I guess we all learned something," Clay said eventually. "Max is proof that you don't give up on the ones you love, no matter what." Carl nodded, shaking Clay's hand before he left. The conversation left Clay thoughtful, more determined than ever to find a new normal with Max, one built on mutual trust and safety, free from the ghosts of the accident. Meanwhile, finished editing the documentary. He sent Clay a private link to watch the rough cut. Clay settled onto the couch, Max at his side, laptop balanced on his lap. The opening shots depicted a lonely road, the camera panning across abandoned farmland. A gentle narrator's voice began telling Max's tale, weaving interviews with scenic footage, culminating in Clay's emotional recounting. The final montage showed their reunion in the hospital, Clay's tearful apology and Max's unwavering joy. As the credits rolled, Clay's throat tightened. Max must have sensed his emotion because he leaned in, nuzzling Clay's shoulder. Clay closed the laptop, tears hanging on his lashes. "That's our story, bud," he whispered. "And we lived it. We survived it." The film was released online a week later, sparking a fresh wave of attention. Comments flooded in. Messages of awe, gratitude, and even heartbreak from those who wished they'd shared such a bond in their own lives. Donations to the local shelter spiked. Volunteers signed up in record numbers. The intangible ripple effect of Max's journey spread outward, touching lives far beyond the small circle of people who had known them personally. Clay saw the messages as a chance to highlight dog adoption. He worked with the shelter to create a small fundraiser, bringing Max along to greet visitors. The line wound around the block, children and adults clamoring for a moment with the miracle dog. Max, for his part, handled it calmly, wagging his tail and soaking up the attention. But every few minutes he would glance at Clay to ensure he was still there, as if needing that visual anchor. Clay always was, of course, standing close by, proud and humble at the same time. Life found a new rhythm. The intense scrutiny eventually waned, replaced by a quieter but no less meaningful presence in the community. Clay progressed in his physical therapy, gradually regaining strength. Max thrived under the consistent care, his once patchy coat now glossy and thick. They went on morning jogs, slow at first, picking up pace as Clay's stamina returned. Over time, it became a cherished ritual. The crisp air, the rising sun, and the comforting sound of Max's paws padding alongside him. Some months later, Clay sat by the window, gazing out at the golden light of late afternoon. His brace was gone. A shallow scar on his temple bore testimony to the accident, but otherwise he looked like a man fully returned to life. Max dozed at his feet. The phone rang and Clay picked up. It was the hospital nurse who'd helped Max. She told him about a patient recently admitted, a young woman who had lost everything in a house fire. She had nowhere to go after her release. She also had a small dog that needed temporary care. The nurse wondered if Clay could help, at least until they found a more permanent solution. He looked at Max, who was now awake, ears perked. The memory of how others had stepped up for them in their darkest moments nudged his conscience. "Yes," he said softly, "I'd be happy to help." That night, Clay and Max prepared a makeshift bed in the living room. The next day, the nurse brought the young woman and her tiny terrier mix named Scruffles. Max greeted the stranger dog with a tilt of his head, tail wagging. Scruffles trembled, her eyes reflecting the trauma of losing her home. Clay knelt down, letting her sniff his hand. He remembered how frightened Max had been once back when they first met at the shelter. "I'm Clay," he said gently to the woman. "This is Max. We've been through some tough times ourselves, so we get it." She gave a small, tearful smile. "Thank you," she whispered. And so Clay and Max's world expanded again. It wasn't easy. The young woman was in shock, grappling with grief, but Clay offered what support he could. Max did his part, too, nudging Scruffles into little bursts of playful chase around the apartment. The dogs formed a quick camaraderie, tails wagging in a cautious dance. As the days turned to weeks, Clay helped the young woman find housing assistance, introduced her to local support groups, and even set her up with some job leads. In her darkest moments, she clung to Scruffles and found a sense of hope in Max's story. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, the young woman said, "I saw the documentary about you too. It gave me the courage to believe that no matter how lost you feel, there's always a way forward. Thank you for reminding me of that." Clay's eyes flicked to Max, who lay content by the couch. He couldn't help but smile through the thickness in his throat. If his and Max's ordeal served any purpose, it was that, offering a lifeline to someone else drifting in uncertainty. Eventually, the woman found a modest apartment across town. Scruffles danced around her feet as she packed. With tears of gratitude, she promised to keep in touch. Clay and Max waved them off, the door closing on another chapter. That night, Clay and Max took a stroll under a canopy of stars. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves and Max sniffed at the air, tail lifting. Clay let out a content sigh. They had walked a path paved with suffering and sheer will. And yet somehow that path led here, to a place of renewed purpose, empathy, and quiet joy. In that midnight hush, Clay knelt down and hugged Max. The dog licked his cheek, a soft whine of contentment slipping from his muzzle. Clay whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." It wasn't just about the day Max left the diner, or the weeks he spent searching. It was about everything they'd shared since. Max had reminded Clay that second chances were not just gifts. They were responsibilities, invitations to live more deeply, love more fully. They walked on, side by side, shadows merging under the pale moonlight. In the distance, a lone car hummed along the road, a far cry from the heavy traffic and chaos that once nearly claimed both their lives. Clay's steps were steady now, his heart unburdened. He didn't know what new trials the future might hold, but as long as Max walked with him, he had the courage to face them. And Max, with each confident stride, seemed to say the same. Together they were unstoppable.